If I asked you, what is the dramatic climax of the Lord of the Rings film trilogy, what would you say? What is the precise moment when the central dramatic question of the film is answered? What is the final turning point in the story's drama? And can you pin it down to the exact shot? Well, if you said it's this moment when Frodo dangles the Ring of Power over the cracks of doom with the fate of Middle Earth hanging in the balance, you are close. But technically, this is not where the drama in Peter Jackson's film reaches its ultimate peak. In order to see what the real dramatic climax is, we're going to go on a little adventure of our own through the characters, story arcs, and themes of Middle Earth. And we're going to frame our analysis as an apparently simple question: what is the moral of The Lord of the Rings? As we'll see, the process of exploring this question will not only help us to identify the correct climax of the film, but it will also give us a special insight into how Peter Jackson crafted such an incredible adaptation of Tolkien's story. So let's get into it on the art of storytelling. First, I should clarify what I mean by the question, what is the moral of The Lord of the Rings? What does it mean to ask that question? Generally speaking, a story attains its purpose by expressing a moral truth. So the expression goes that every good story has a moral. A basic example is the timeless fable of The Boy Who Cried Wolf. If I ask you to tell me the moral of that story, you understand I'm asking you to translate that story into a brief moral assertion. This might be something like, liars are not believed even when they tell the truth. Or it could be a simple injunction like, don't lie. And it doesn't take a whole lot of literary analysis to figure that out. The story of The Boy Who Cried Wolf is about as rudimentary as stories can get, so its moral is plain on its surface. The story is didactic, meaning that its purpose is primarily to teach a moral lesson rather than to entertain. Now, larger and more complex stories are fundamentally the same in that their function is still to impart a moral lesson. But obviously, they are much more open to analysis. If I ask you, what is the moral of Moby Dick? And you say, revenge is a vain pursuit, you're correct in a sense. But translating Moby Dick into this kind of brief didactic statement also reduces that story's meaning to the point of annihilating it. So there are limitations to discussing a text in terms of its moral, but there's also a big benefit. It can sometimes provide a window into how storytellers compose their stories because it gives us a clue about the author's general framework for orienting and constructing their narrative. And that's definitely the case with Peter Jackson's trilogy, which is a sprawling epic fantasy full of mythic archetypes and heroic narratives, all pointing towards a very clear and very focused moral resolution. So, by identifying the precise moment of that resolution, we can infer how Peter Jackson was thinking about his adaptation of the story. So, my intent here is not to argue for any particular interpretation of the Lord of the Rings films, but instead to see what we can learn from the writing choices in these films. So, one way into this analysis is to compare the moral of the films to the moral of the books. It's generally accepted that the films are about as good a screen adaptation of The Lord of the Rings as you could ever realistically hope for. But I'm also sympathetic to the argument made by some fans that some of Tolkien's intent in the story might have been lost in translation, especially with regards to its moral implications. This is not a criticism of the films, it's just an acknowledgement that books and films are fundamentally different media, and one cannot simply translate one into the other. Tolkien's story contains a lot of detail and nuance that could never be adequately translated into an action adventure motion picture. And this, of course, means that Peter Jackson's films must omit a lot from the story. And naturally, these omissions were made for good, practical reasons like pacing, tension, and runtime. But it's an interesting question. Do these omissions significantly alter the moral of Tolkien's original story? So let's look at two of the biggest omissions from the original story. The first of which is, of course, Tom Bombadil. For those of you who haven't read the book, the hobbits encounter this character just before reaching the village of Bree. He saves the hobbits from being suffocated by a tree and kind of heals them and sings songs to them and sends them on their way. If this sounds a little bit familiar, it's because it is alluded to in the extended edition of The Two Towers, with Treebeard filling in for Bombadil.
Away with you. You should not be waking.
In any case, he's an intriguing character because his place in the supernatural order of Tolkien's universe is left tantalizingly ambiguous. It's kind of implied that he's extremely powerful, but his origins are never really explained. And curiously, he seems to have immunity over the power of the ring. He kind of plays with it and never really tries to take it for himself. So despite being a really interesting character, it's easy to see why Peter Jackson chose to omit him from the story. The preceding scene in the film is all about the impending danger of the ring. We learn that the forces of evil are already mobilized and Frodo must urgently get to Bree. We also learn that the ring is so dangerous that even the mighty Gandalf will not dare to touch it.
Don't tempt me, Frodo.
So showing Tom Bombadil fooling around and doing magic tricks with the ring as he does in the book would completely deflate any sense of urgency and gravity in Frodo's quest. So Jackson probably made the right call, but the question remains, does the omission of Tom Bombadil alter the moral of Tolkien's story in a significant way? The existence of Tom Bombadil's character does suggest that the ring has a more subtle and complex relationship to the beings that inhabit Tolkien's universe. Bombadil's immunity to the ring implies that there are forces at play that transcend the present conflict between good and evil in Middle-earth. In other words, the omission of this minor character does have major implications for the mythological order that our characters inhabit. The presence or absence of Tom Bombadil subtly changes the ring's symbolic meaning, and therefore does change what Frodo's quest ultimately represents. Now, the other major omission in the films is the notorious penultimate chapter of Return of the King called The Scouring of the Shire. If you haven't read the books, by the way, there's some major spoilers coming up here. Needless to say that if you thought that the Return of the King had a few too many endings, then be glad that Peter Jackson and his team opted to omit this chapter. So in the book, after the ring has been destroyed and the hobbits return to Hobbiton, they find that Saruman and Wormtongue have transformed the Shire into a kind of industrialized wasteland, and the hobbits are living under a tyranny. This leads the hobbits to wage war against Saruman in the Battle of Bywater. Again, one can see why Peter Jackson and his team chose to omit this part of the story. This would have been the absolute definition of anticlimactic, and for a film that's already testing the practical limits of runtime, this was simply not an option. But just like with Tom Bombadil, the omission of this chapter has implications for the story's moral. In Jackson's story, evil appears to be vanquished from Middle-earth. Full stop. It feels very decisive and final. But in Tolkien's story, evil appears to persist in Middle-earth despite the destruction of the One Ring. That's a pretty big difference, enough that I think one could plausibly debate whether the Lord of the Rings films ultimately tell the same story as the book. It's like, imagine if somebody wrote a film adaptation of The Boy Who Cried Wolf, in which the boy heroically fights off the wolves at the end and his sheep survive and everyone lives happily ever after. That's a different moral because it's a different story. Tolkien was crystal clear that he had no interest in allegory whatsoever.
Is the book to be considered as an allegory?
No. I just like allegory whenever I smell it.
But it has nonetheless been speculated that The Hobbit's homecoming was influenced by Tolkien's own experience coming home from the First World War and finding that greed and exploitation were nonetheless in full vigor in his home country, and that totalitarianism was on the rise in Europe. If that is the case, and if Tolkien intended to subvert the reader's expectation of a neat and tidy hero's return, then it could be argued that the films completely miss the point of the books by omitting this very deliberate dose of disillusionment after the ring is destroyed. Though there are some clues that Jackson, being a First World War history buff himself, did find his own way of referencing that conflict. By the way, Peter Jackson also alludes to the scouring of the Shire when Frodo looks into Galadriel's mirror in the first film. In that scene, she says that this is what will come to pass if Frodo fails in his quest. That is quite different from Tolkien's version, in which it does come to pass despite the fact that Frodo succeeds. Again, this fundamentally changes the symbolic meaning of the ring and its destruction. So, both the Scouring of the Shire and Tom Bombadil, each in their own way, suggest that the destruction of the Ring of Power is not the ultimate end of evil, which makes sense given how the events of The Lord of the Rings are just one part of Tolkien's much more expansive mythology, one that is very skillfully implied in the films, but certainly not as thoroughly described as it is in Tolkien's writing. So, with the context of the books in mind, let's analyze Jackson's films and try to find the moral of his version of the story. To do this, let's quickly identify some of the most important dramatic moments in the trilogy and see if there's some common theme that unites them. The first that comes to mind is self-sacrifice, especially in order to protect one's friends. Very often, these sacrifices are made in the face of insurmountable adversity. We very often see our heroes charging directly into danger and certain death in order to protect the ones they care about.
For Frodo.
Certainly, the bonds of friendship is another identifiable theme. Our characters stay true to one another, no matter what. Usually, these are bonds of brotherhood, but even Aragorn and Arwen's romantic subplot culminates in her decision to stay true to him, also, incidentally, at great personal sacrifice. And of course, there's the idea that apparently insignificant people can be hugely consequential in the fate of the world. This obviously applies to the hobbits, who venture outside of their insular world and journey to the literal end of the earth to confront evil. But it also applies to other characters whose subplots sort of flow like tributaries into this main theme. Eowyn's subplot would fit nicely into this category.
I am no man.
And it also includes Treebeard's realization that the Ents have a duty to defend the natural world from exploitation. Taken together, I'd say all these pivotal dramatic moments can be reduced to a common didactic moral assertion. Something like, evil is overcome through courageous loyalty to one's friends. And it's pretty clear that this central theme served as a kind of North Star for just about every decision made in the script. One clue is that the antagonistic forces in the story almost always manifest as the opposite of friendship and loyalty. Evil is generally not represented as Sauron wielding his mace, or even as the Eye of Sauron. Instead, evil appears in the moments when a character considers betraying his loyalty to his friends. This is often accompanied by the voice of Sauron quietly whispering in the Black Speech, and of course, is often accompanied by the ring. It is certainly not a coincidence that the character who tests Frodo is, first and foremost, a liar and a traitor, and one who already failed the test of loyalty to friends in a way that is surely intended to directly contrast Sam and Frodo's relationship. It's not a coincidence that Sauron deceived and betrayed the elves and dwarves and men for whom he originally forged the Rings of Power. It's not a coincidence that the big moment of crisis in Return of the King is Gollum using deception to break Frodo's loyalty to Sam. And it's not a coincidence that the trilogy's climactic monologue is delivered by that character who most embodies the virtues of loyalty, Samwise Gamgee, who, by the way, plays a central role in the climactic scenes of all three films. And the fact that Jackson gave these key monologues to Sam shows that Jackson might view that character as the primary expositor of the story's moral. So, this brings us full circle to the original question of this video. What is the climax of the entire trilogy, and can we identify the exact shot? We've established that the common thread that binds all the subplots and supporting characters together could be formulated as something like evil is overcome through courageous loyalty to one's friends. So, given the epic nature of this trilogy, we should expect that its climax clearly and succinctly expresses that idea. That's why the scene of Frodo dangling the ring over the cracks of doom cannot serve as the trilogy's true dramatic climax. The question of whether Frodo will literally destroy the ring is not a sufficient test of Frodo's character. In fact, the scene of Frodo's first attempt to destroy the ring only creates more dramatic tension. Frodo is in this moment captured by the power of the ring.
The ring is mine.
this leads to the struggle with Gollum, who finally succeeds in getting the precious. They struggle one more time and both fall over the edge. And we get this chilling moment of Gollum falling to his death, still vainly trying to protect the ring. Sam peers over the edge, and here we get the absolute climax of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. The dramatic question of the films is not whether Frodo will succeed in destroying the ring. After all, the ring is not destroyed the instant it hits the lava in Mount Doom. It stays floating on the surface. That's because Frodo has not yet made the most critical moral decision of the film. At this point, the markings on the ring appear. That's because it's surrounded by fire, but it also functions as one final moment of crisis for our main character. It's the final temptation of Sauron and the One Ring. It's calling for Frodo to let go, just as Sam is calling for Frodo to take his hand. And this is the climax of the trilogy. It's the shot where Frodo grabs Sam's hand. This is the story's final turning point. It is signaled by the final destruction of the ring, which seems to be destroyed by Frodo's decision to grab Sam's hand, as if that decision were itself the final triumph over evil. This moment of moral clarification is called catharsis. It's the emotional release immediately after the resolution of a story's primary conflict. I'm certain that Peter Jackson was thinking of this shot as the turning point of the film, and there's a big clue in the climax of Fellowship of the Ring that you might never have noticed. When Sam chases after Frodo's boat and struggles to stay afloat, it's Frodo who rescues him from drowning. And wouldn't you know, it's the exact same shot, except their places are reversed. It's one of those subconscious things that you only get in films that are very thoughtfully written and storyboarded, and it's a very powerful way of articulating the story's moral. The quest succeeds because Sam and Frodo remain loyal to each other. And if you had to summarize the moral of the entire trilogy in an image, I'd say this side by side of these two shots really says it all, probably better than any didactic little sentence ever could. What this analysis shows is that having a clear sense of your story's moral is extremely useful when you're bringing a story into being, whether you're writing a book or shooting a movie or working in any other medium. This does not mean that the moral of a story should be spelled out. And as both Tolkien's and Jackson's stories show, a lot of the magic happens in the interpretation. But at the end of the day, stories are how we make sense of what is right. And to the extent that a story grapples with some kind of moral question, that story will achieve something much greater than mere entertainment. So thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you want me to keep making videos, and I'll see you on the next one.